During some cave exploration, or splunking, my family and some friends were in some deep caves, and as we're heading out, we found a slit about knee height in the rock. Getting on your stomach, there was a tight squeeze you could get into that led to a small crawl space that was actually inside the rock. There's quasar growing on the ceiling, making for a beautiful crystal ceiling display. So we went in one by one, and if you're claustrophobic, this place is your living nightmare. Most times you can actually feel the ceiling on your back and the floor on your stomach. I mean literally, every single time that you took a breath, you would feel the rocks on your back. So we went in deep, and it was just incredible. It was like a small well tucked away within solid rock. I had now made it in as deep as I could go without turning. To the left, there was a place I could go to, but it was covered in crystals and sediment. Now everybody was having a grand old time, until suddenly we started feeling trickles of water on our backs. Turned out it was raining outside, so with the way that the crawl space dipped down, it would mean that this whole place would be filled up with rainwater pretty damn quick, with the only way for it to drain out was the way that we come in. It started as trickles, before it went to a stream and began to pool up. Being in the deepest part of the cave meant that there were crystals right above your back, and the only way to get out was to go on your stomach. I started to panic. Everybody crawled out as fast as they could, trying to keep the water from coming in. The streams kept growing larger and larger. We left one at a time as fast as we could, but it wasn't fast enough. I could feel the water coming up to my chin as I crawled behind my brother. Each inch I took felt painfully slow, and I could feel the walls compressing around me. The water was unrelenting, now splashing against my panicked squirms. I did manage to get out of the water though, just as it reached my lips. Everybody got out safely. I'm never going cave exploring again. Another perk of navigating previously charted caves is that you know exactly what you're getting yourself in for. You know if it will be long or short, easy or difficult, and can oftentimes decide which route you're going to be taking. Again, there's really nothing like that when I'm doing it. That's where the thrill comes from for me, being somewhere that you shouldn't and that nobody else has went. Now, there was a system in South Dakota. It was very, very deep into the woods, well from the trails that I'd started on. At first I was just hiking, not even necessarily looking to cave, but when I happened upon its mouth, I had figured my stuff already, and it wasn't as if the forest was getting any more interesting. It occurred to me that as I entered this cave in this moment, the mouth was at a very appropriate word for the entrance. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being swallowed, like a shrimp going into a trap. Of course you always get these feelings though, and you never know what's going to happen. The cave ceilings were high. The strange surface cast weird shadows in front of me. They always stayed in front of me. Now it was only after a few minutes of navigation that the pillars began to show up. Just natural stone poles connecting the floor and the ceiling. The increase in density started to make me wonder if I'd be able to actually navigate the system after all. I'm not claustrophobic, and you can't be when you're a caver. The thing was, things started getting seriously tight. I began making turns, and I was only met with gaps that were too narrow to go through. I suppose this was a rookie mistake. One turn led to another, and then it all come crashing down on me at once. This was a maze cave. I didn't know where the hell I was anymore. Now I could just sit here and tell you about the almost 2.5-hour ride of panic and desperation I found myself in, trying my best to navigate a web of stones and tunnels that I didn't know the first thing about, preparing mentally to face the fact that I very well could die in that cave, but not before my battery ran out. I'd die cold, hungry, in the dark. But I won't. Instead I'll tell you where, almost all at once, a pillar formation ceased, and I found myself looking into a passage that very clearly dropped off at the end. A sort of presence emanated from the end of the tunnel, a sound, a distinct humming. When I breathed in, I was floored with the smell. A wave of hot and sticky odour of salt and rotting flesh slammed to me. It was almost dizzying how foul it was, covering my nose with my hand. I racked my brain with all of the cave-in knowledge that I had, just trying to do my best to be able to help myself get out of here. but I couldn't even remember anything really. Slowly I crept forward. If whatever this was potentially a way out of here or not, I had to find out. The path couldn't have been more than 10 meters long, but it felt like an eternity. The heat actually began intensifying to a near sweltering level. I crested down. I gazed down. Into the cavern I found before me. My light penetrated the darkness, but only just. Now, I may have been panicking, dehydrated, but I was of sound mind when looking into that abyss. Stretched out in front of me, its bulk barely fitting into the cavern floor. I saw a whale, a tremendous one, whose carcass was rotting, and the heat and stink of seawater as if it had washed up on a beach. But this was no beach, this is South Dakota, the middle of it, and there wasn't a single reason on earth that it should be here. There wasn't a single way it could be here, so instead of pondering it further, I stumbled back and back into the rest of the cave. I felt like I was on autopilot. I was suddenly, barely conscious, backtracking my steps with clarity, further and further away from something that I felt that I knew was there but couldn't see. After a long period of time, I reached the surface levels, and I exited the mouth of the cave. I never ever went back. It's just truly horrible when your mind plays tricks on you like that and you know it. You don't even know if you're actually going to get out of these places alive, or if you're going to get there and find that the world's not as it should be, and maybe you've lost your mind in the cave. I had a pretty terrifying experience in a cave. It was me, my brother, and a friend. We're in Pepper Sauce Cave, Arizona. We were deep inside, and I found a small tunnel that went off to the right of the path that you can crawl through. This tunnel was very narrow, so I had to crawl slowly, and you could almost feel the top press against your back. I told my brother to wait for 15 minutes, and if I didn't come back again, go and get me. So I crawl in about 80 feet, and this tunnel starts to branch off to the right. It's getting smaller and smaller. I thought I saw an opening at the end. I get closer with my flashlight, and the opening's not near as big as I thought it was. Now it's time to turn round, but I have no room. The walls are almost on both sides of my ribs, and the ceiling was literally on top of my back. So 50 feet later, I'm crawling backwards on my chest. It was very difficult because there wasn't any room to turn around in, so I managed to get myself turned around at one point and head back. The tunnel looks different now and branched off onto another path that I didn't see crawling around, but crawling back it was visible. Now I was totally lost and disorientated. I was on my stomach and very cramped. I was also pretty nervous. I started to scream to my brother and friend, but I didn't hear them. I screamed louder and louder, but they couldn't hear me. I thought that maybe this was it. I crawled on my stomach a little further and tried again. I could very, very faintly hear voices now. It turned out that they were below me. Now the thing is, the more you panic, the more that your chest is going to open up, so the less air you're going to have, and eventually you can suffocate. I then yelled at my brother in desperation at the top of my lungs to come and get me. He then starts crawling and yelling at me. This whole time, I have no idea where the voice was, and I didn't even recognize it because of where it is echoing. Suddenly around the bend, I do see a very, very far away flashlight. I've never been so happy to see him in my life. I started cave exploring when I was 17. My dad was an experienced climber and would every once in a while swap a mountain for a cave. That's how I grew up to love it. It was my job, well, part-time. My main career is in finance. I had to survey caves that were unexplored or abandoned. My clients usually want me to make sure that it's safe for them to construct above the cave or something like that. I've done it all over the world, but most things that happened was in England and Wales, so this is in 2004. So one of my first assignments was to go and explore a cave with 3 other guys in Pembrokeshire. It's a relatively small cave, off the map and pretty hard to find. I think the clients wanted to see if it led to coal or something, I can't quite remember. Anyway, there's a team of 3 of us that head into the cave. It's quite a small entry, very narrow. We sent each other down rappelling one at a time. Being the nice guy that I am, I decided to go down first. Now this is actually when I had my first fright occur. On my way down, about 10 minutes until I could reach the bottom away, I couldn't help but think I was seeing flickering lights echoing in the cave below. Really dull lighting, but it was there nonetheless. Now at the time I thought maybe my eyes had just adjusted to the light, but it kept on happening. I shouted at the team and they said that it's probably just showing that there's water reflecting off something. However, I wasn't so sure. I've never seen this before. So I made it into the bottom and the others started to follow. I'd light up the way ready for them, so I put my glow stick around the surface to make it safer for them. The cave now glowed. As soon as I could see with the light, I saw that the cavern was filled with very smooth walls. This isn't normal for a cave. My team finally reached the surface of the cavern and we all looked pretty surprised. Wales is actually famed for its mining history, so it could have just been a mine that was abandoned before. So we set up, we put down our tents and planned our move. However, we were suddenly interrupted by something that shivered me. As soon as we started talking, there were these 3 loud knocks, almost like metal was striking the rock. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This would happen randomly, and at the same time in a tempo. We had to figure out what this was. We went to quickly grab our things, but one team member didn't want to join us. We'll just call him JJ. He kept saying that he didn't like the thoughts of it. So we wandered into this smaller cavern which branched off of the main one. It was much longer and tighter than we thought it would be. It was really strange and claustrophobic. Now we pushed and pushed through in the hope that we would find the source of the knocking. However, what we found was much more alarming. We continued through this cavern, but the light started. The closer we got, the more we drew to the conclusion that this wasn't light off the water. The flashes were heavy and broken, and the reflections would be continuous. So the person in front, let's call her Jane, went really slow. She was certain that we needed a proper defense, just in case anything happened. Now, usually we carry knives and hook blades to defend ourselves. That's because lots of animals can go down here, and sometimes they get attacked by them, or even squatters. So she decided to go back and get some stuff. We said that we'd wait. We didn't. I took the lead in front of Jake, our cartographer. We walked further and further until the light got brighter and brighter. It was at the end of this cavern, and we're suddenly greeted by a very large, suspicious opening with lots of light reflecting off the walls. The ground was very wet and muddy, unusual for a cave, but the usuality of it got more prominent. As Jake was looking around, he suddenly came to a stop, turned and shook his head violently. The first thing that I asked is if he had been hit by a rock or smacked his head on the wall or something, but when I turned he said no. These are his exact words that I always remember. "Please tell me you heard that." No, this can't be happening." I said I didn't hear anything. "What the hell was that noise, man?" He described it as a crying, whimpering sound, as if somebody was screaming in anger, pain or loss. Now wolves don't go down here that often, and it could have been them, but I thought it was very unlikely just because of how deep we were and we couldn't find any drop-ins. Though sometimes there are caves full of wolves. Now wind can also play a part. It creates some pretty blood-curdling sounds. Anyway, I comfort him. He then laughs and thinks that he's gone crazy. Turns out he wasn't. He still wanted to continue. So here we go, and this is where it gets bad. We had to continue walking for about another 10 minutes trying to find the source of the light. We then hit a smaller cavern. This is where the light source was. Inside, we found a truly bizarre item, a house torch. Not a professional one, an average one, and it was flickering on and off. Now light can travel pretty far, especially in cave systems. You can see sources from miles away. This is a rather open cave, so you get some pretty interesting light displays. But this was strange. A normal flashlight. This shows that somebody's found their way down here. We continued past the torch. I switched it off. We then find a kitchen knife and a GPS on the floor. Now we knew somebody's been down here, or is down here. The odd thing about the knife was it was blunted, snapped, and almost in half. I found this odd. She must have stuck it in something. We kept on walking, and here's where we found our person of interest. Now, I'm good at stories, but this is one of the most horrifying discoveries that I've ever made. I'll try and put the emotion into this, but you'll truly never feel it. We found a body, a nearly decomposing one. She was a woman in her 30s, I'd say. She'd been here for months. Of course, this made us all start panicking. I threw up. The smell was horrifying. She looked like she was brutally thrown about. Jake said that maybe she had slipped and fell, but I don't understand how a fall could be that hard, especially where she had no height damage to cause this. We ran back to the base, we told the others and left. The local police were contacted and the forensics came down. Turns out, the girl had actually died from blunt force injury that caused the bleeding. The coroner calls us both in, and he's found something pretty disturbing. I think a person done this. The injuries, no fall made them, and it's too isolating. Now, I don't know what happened after this. I really don't. I don't think they identified her, and nobody was found after. I have no idea what the scream sound was. I don't have any of the answers to this. I just hope that she can rest in peace. I grew up down in the desert where there was a lot of abandoned old mine shafts. We would go explore the mine shafts for fun. There would always be some level of danger though. It was common to see old abandoned boxes of dynamite and leftover mining equipment. One time we went there and explored this vertical mine shaft which had a ladder that worked its way down. The ladder had a platform at about every 20 feet and a hatch that would continue to the next level. I was with about 6 people, I believe. We'd gone down to the bottom of the mine shaft itself, and I guess it was about 700 feet down at this point, and we get to the point where the shaft was full of water. We all decided to go swimming in the water, which was creepy in its own right, but as we're climbing up, I was looking up and I could see a light moving above. I then realised that there was somebody else in the mine shaft. I came to one of the hatches and just poked my head out. I looked to my right and see a flashlight moving rapidly towards me, and the hatch was slammed shut. Somebody was standing on the hatch and I could not open it. I was able to open the hatch after about 5 minutes, but it turned out to be somebody that recognised our cars and was a friend of ours just messing with us. I know it didn't turn out to be anything too bad, but this is a very terrifying moment. The scary thing is, what if he had actually broke the hatch and locked us in there? When I was about 14, I lived in a very small town. My dad was there on a temporary assignment. It was the summer of my 8th grade year and we were about to move back to the city. I had a friend Lawrence who I met at the local middle school. Since my family was leaving in a couple of weeks, she let me stay over the night at Lawrence's house. Lawrence was a cool guy, but he would always try and act tougher than he actually was. That morning, Lawrence tells me that he's found a cave in the woods about 2 miles out and said he wants to go exploring it. So we get to the location. It's pretty far in the woods and very hidden. When we walk in, we discover that other people have been there before. We see lots of beer bottles and potato chip bags and other stuff. There's basically lots of junk. Then a little further into the cave, we stumble into this area. This is when my note meter started going crazy. This area had this putrid smell and was lined with garbage. I actually saw a few needles. And at the time, I wasn't sure what they were for. There was a grocery bag that seemed to be for their portable outhouse and makeshift beds. Somebody or some people were living there. I know that there's homeless people in here, but at this point, I don't know who it could be, so I'm on very high alert. Now, in all honesty, at this point, I'm very nervous. The next thing I picked up though was beyond creepy. It looked like an old photo album. I picked up the album with one hand and held the flashlight with my other trembling. The first thing I saw looked like vintage photos of a prison. However, I then saw a picture of a pile of dead bodies. I immediately recognised that this was from the Holocaust, and you could see some of them wearing the stars on their uniform. There were literally just pages of concentration camp photos. When I turned to the next page, I noticed the two were stuck together. I took a second to realise that it was blood that caused this. It's hard to describe the feeling I had, but you can tell it's evil in its purest form. At this point, my note meter jumped from 9 to 20. Now at this point Lawrence was behind me, but I don't think he had seen the book yet. I just said to him, "Can we get out of here?" And to my surprise, he said yes, and we started running and didn't stop until we got home. I realised when we got back that he had a look of pure dread on his face. I told him about the book I found, then he told me what he found. There was some really dodgy photos that were in a corner somewhere. Just as he started going through them, he heard somebody behind us, and it was clear that they coughed by accident and accidentally given away their position. They were trying desperately not to be noticed. Just as he's about to tell us to get out of here, that's when I come over. When we finally told his parents the next day, the police were called, but nothing was found other than the trash. Sadly, nothing ever come of it. I go caving with my dad. He actually grew up mining uranium until his family's mine went bust. He's pretty used to enclosed spaces and being underground. I was kinda raised in the same thing, but without the radon gas. I have rappelled into pits I can't see the bottom of, bouldered my way along and gone to some of the largest underwater rivers in North America. I was nearly caught in a flash flood. I slipped into a crevasse whose bottom is, as of this day, not even mapped out or documented. No human's ever been down there. Now this was by far the scariest thing that ever happened to me. I braced myself with my feet, back against one wall and legs stretched out in front of me, arms on either side. I was in pretty good shape and I was in a pretty good spot to be. It was roughly 10 feet down. It was wet and smooth rock. My headlamp had come unplugged from its battery in the pack. This meant the only light I had was from my dad looking down on me about 10 feet up. Because how badly stuck I got, my dad actually had to go and get some rope. This meant that I would be completely alone now. I was worried that he might never find me again. I was in that place for an hour. God, did it feel like so much longer. I thought the fall itself was scary, but it was nothing compared to that. Complete darkness. It was so quiet. I mean, I could hear my blood rushing in my ears. I could hear my knees cracking under the pressure. Every piece of gravel that came loose from the thread of my boots hitting the sides of the crevasse on its way down. Just fading. I started to see lights in little flashes. I couldn't tell if my eyes were opened or closed. I couldn't move to check, or I'd fall into God knows what. I could hear more than I ever should have while waiting. And all I could feel was a rock against my back and hands, and presumably where my feet were braced against. I started to not be able to tell up from down and started hearing footsteps and seeing movement from shapes that weren't actually there. It was utter hell waiting for my dad to return with rope. I know what I've experienced was just due to lack of visual and auditory simulation, but God, it was the most scary thing that, and probably always will be, I've ever experienced. I was exploring alone in a large ancient cemetery outside of a small town in Israel. These were Canaanite tombs that were thousands of years old. Many in this religion has been left unexcavated, so the whole area was looking like a huge low hill full of little dimples, and I knew that these were where the tombs were. So I was wandering around these shaft tombs, which dug deep into the ground and then branched out into spots that were carved out for family members to be laid in. Some of the tombs were actually open to the air and very deep. I got a little too close to the edge and fell in. I fell maybe 10 feet and got stuck down there. It was a vertical drop and the sides were loose stone and rubble. It was the middle of the day in Israel in summer. I had no water. My cell phone wouldn't get any connection because how deep I was. I remember just standing there, looking up out of this hole in the ground with the blazing sun above, realizing how silent it was. It was a truly awful feeling, stuck in an ancient grave. I literally experienced a silence that had probably not been heard before by any other people. It was truly harrowing to say the very least. Anyway, I tried to scramble out, but the sides were just too eroded. I couldn't do anything. I was really scared that I might actually die down there. I mean, the most recent people to visit were probably thousands of years ago. Anyway, I decided that I just had to wait it out. After 15 minutes of the most unbearable time of my life, I managed to lever my way up by holding onto some of the roots and branches that thank God were actually there. The feeling of getting the heck out of there was incredible. I rarely shared this experience because I was such a fool. Caving in an unmapped, unregulated and unknown area is extremely risky. I don't recommend it to anyone, even experienced cavers. Now if you're anything like me, that won't stop you. Maybe you need a few of my stories of what I encountered trying to discover caves to convince you. Even though a cave isn't charted, it doesn't mean that nobody's been there. Now there's lots of caves that are already charted, but they have very unsafe supports and whatnot, hazardous areas and everything that you wouldn't want to go to, but that's much less of a concern. There's nothing like that when going into a new area. This particular incident happened in the Appalachians and was deep enough into the forests of the mountains that nobody had ever discovered it yet, or didn't want to go deep in enough to be considered a proper system. Either way, I was going to find out. I had the help of my high-powered headlamp. I ventured into the relatively gentle downward slope of its mouth. When I'm doing this, I sort of leave a crumb trail in the form of glowing sticks. The moment I lose sight of my last one, I plant a new one somewhere, stable and visible. It's kind of like a map. I use it and it's helped me a lot. Now, not long after entering this cave, the ceiling began to lower, the walls were damp, making the light of my headlamp reflect along the walls. After walking in a slight crouch for a short time, the cave opened into a new chamber. All along the spherical interior were passageways that presumably led into a massive expansive system. It looked like the caver's dream. I then began to explore the various mouths of the cave. The question began burning in the back of my mind as to why this place hadn't been mapped out yet. I recognised that multiple entries were choked, or rather, they'd been sealed off by a cave-in. I carefully investigated these proportions, being very wary of the stability of them. The rest of the entries looked promising, however. That is until I reached the leftmost choke. Multiple large stones and dense proportions of rubble effectively sealed off the passageway. Similar to others, I quickly began sweeping it with my headlamp. If I was a second quicker, I would have missed it. A swatch of blue fabric, squeezed between two layers of heavier stones. It kind of looked like a demon. I backtracked, investigated the chokes that I'd already checked once more. Eventually I caught something that I didn't see the first time. A proportion of rubble looked to be looser than the rest of the debris, as if somebody was pushing up from under it. Sweeping the rocks away, I nearly slipped back in shock. A deep purple, limp hand stuck out from between two stones. It hadn't even decomposed yet. I really quickly ran out of there, realising just how compromised this system really was. Anyway, I reported the location to the forest services. I did this in anonymity, and the last thing I heard was that it was completely boarded off. On more than one occasion that I've entered a cave, usually in quite isolated areas by the way, there was somebody that was already there. Well, I suppose not there. Every time that this happened, it's always been uniquely unsettling. Once I was navigating the mouth of a cave that required me to enter chimney style. This is where you place your arms and legs on either side of you of a narrow vertical passage and kind of go down like a crab. After reaching the floor, I found that it was hardly more than just that, and the only other thing being a hollow dome proportion that could have been maybe 5 meters across and higher. More than disappointing, I was shocked. There was a blanket, wrappers and empty bottles of water everywhere. Turning around to the other side was mostly bare except some scratches on the wall and floor. I left very quickly. I couldn't shake the question of how on earth did a homeless person get in and out of there. Another experience I had was in a smaller system that actually ran along a mine. Neither of the two interfered with one another, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Outside of being a normal trek through some admittedly slim proportions, the only exceptional thing I found was, well, a rounded corner and heard slapping, as if something was running along the floor just out of sight. This was super troubling right off the bat. While it isn't unheard of, animals generally don't get into caves, nor do they go as far in as I was. I was very careful in the approach with a climbing pick in hand. I made the bend round the corner. I didn't know how to feel about it being empty, but I did have a strong feeling of what I was about to see. The passage then continued straight on past where my light illuminated. Those my feet were at a sleeping bag and 2 coolers. Next I found a mess of explicit magazines. Like last time, I pulled out of the cave with no further incident, but knowing the fact that somebody lived all the way down here this whole time, somebody who didn't want to be found, really doesn't sit well with me.